Hello everybody, welcome back to our compound miter saw mini series. We went through part one that covers all of the features of the saw and how to make a simple squared cut. Part two here is going to get into miter cuts and bevel cuts and how to make all the adjustments to make those happen. To start with, let's talk about what a miter cut is. So the easiest way to demonstrate a miter cut is to talk about it relative to a square cut. Remember, we were cutting a 90 degree on the end of this board. Well, what if we wanted to make an angled cut on this board, right? This angled cut, we're going to lay that board flat, and now we can rotate the base of this saw. We press the miter latch. It will go different directions, and it will stop at different angle settings. This saw has some automatic settings on it. So it will lock in, listen to this, it's going to automatically lock into 0, which is our most popular setting. It's also going to lock into 22.5, which is half of 45 degrees. It's also going to lock into 31.5. And when I say lock in, it will not move out of this position until we press the miter latch button. It'll also lock in at 45 degrees. That's another popular setting. This mark here on my board happens to be 45 degrees, but it's in the other direction. So I'll rotate that all the way around, and it's going to lock in at 45 degrees. It won't move. And now we can slide our board in and make this cut. We're going to call that a miter cut. Before I start, let me mention that I have turned this saw a little bit crooked to you at this camera. We're getting a better angle on our close-up camera, and also the saw is not plugged in. I'm leaning all over this saw, so keep in mind this would not be something you would never operate a saw from the back of it or do any of these adjustments when it's plugged in. So here we have all of these stops, automatic stops on our miter angle gauge. They're marked very clearly as to their numbers or the numbers that refer to the angles. Our 0 mark is 90 degrees, and we have all of the other ones. What happens if you want to set this saw at an angle that's not an automatic stop? Well, I will demonstrate that. So we're going to set it at, say, 5 degrees. Okay, so I've set the saw at 5 degrees. There is no lock at 5 degrees. So it will move around freely until I press down on this handle. When I lock that handle down, it's going to clamp this saw into any angle that is on this gauge. It could even be in between two marks, could be a half of a degree. So keep in mind, if you're using an angle setting that's not an automatic stop, you will have to press this lever down. There might be a little different variation on other saws, but generally they're going to have the automatic stops plus this lever or some kind of a locking knob on them. Let's talk about safety when we're working with miter cuts. There is a safer direction to place the angle when we're cutting, and that's always logically going to be away from our supporting hand. So if we're making an angle, I would always try to get my miter to point in this direction. Now when my hand is over here and I'm cutting, the blade is actually traveling further away from my hand. This is a safer situation. The less desirable way would be to turn it this direction. Now this is where all my bad habits could come in of having my hand too close. But still, if my hand is outside of the fence, even this shouldn't be a problem in an extreme miter setting to this side. Here we are in the shop. I want to work you through a miter cut now. Remember, our miter cut was on the face of the board or the broad side of the board. So I'm going to get around here. We've got a setup of our compound miter saw. I've got a nice solid table. I got my outfeed supports, and I got my saw set. So let's get to it. I've already got my mark made on my board here. Don't forget your safety glasses whenever you're in, around, and using this saw. As you can see, I've got my miter angle. I know this is a 45. I measured it with my speed square. I need to set my miter gauge and my miter table to that angle. So remember, you have to release this table. We push the miter latch, and it's going to free that table up. I'm going to put it and lock it into my 45 degree angle here, which is going to match my line. I've chosen to tilt this saw away from my hand. This is a much safer arrangement for a miter cut. The rest of this goes the same way as a typical cut. So I'm going to, with no finger on the trigger, lower the blade, align it with my kerf on the scrap side. I can then lift it off, pull the trigger, and make the cut. Once you're through the material, you can let go of the trigger. Everything's good to go. That is a 45-degree miter cut on a 2x4. So let's make another 45-degree cut on a different board. Here I've got my line. That's my scribe line. I'm going to try to follow that. I'm going to set my miter to 45 degrees. Once it locks in, you'll hear it, and now it's not going to move. I want my piece tight to the fence, flat on the table, and supported with my outfeed support. I've got my hand outside of the fence, my supporting hand. My control hand is on the handle but not on the trigger yet. I'm going to lower the saw and align the left side of the blade with my mark, and that puts my kerf on the scrap or right side of my scribe line. Now I can pull my trigger, get the saw up to speed with it not touching the material, and make the cut. Let off the trigger, let it come to a stop, make sure the blade guard covers the blade. That's a 45-degree cut on a 2x4. Next up, we want to talk about a bevel cut. Bevel cuts are not ones that you're going to use a lot, especially when you're first learning how to use this saw. But I want to talk about them in the sense that this is a potential that the saw can do this, and also we need to check to make sure that the saw is true even if we're making standard cuts. So the bevel setting on this saw is going to, I'm going to set it back to 0 for our miter. The bevel setting is going to tilt the saw this direction. And when we're tilting the saw, this particular saw is what we call a double bevel saw. That means it can tilt in either direction. That would be either left for you or to the right side. When we tilt this saw, I'm going to loosen this, and the saw tilts, then it's going to at some point come in contact with this movable fence part. This is not only dangerous, but it will ruin the blade and the saw can't function. What we need to do is, there's a knob back here, we need to loosen that, and this part of the fence is going to move back and forth. We need to move it out of the way and tighten it back up so that the blade can clear it as it comes down and cuts the material. I've actually seen where these fence pieces, if they didn't get moved out of the way, the blade would actually cut through them, which makes a mess of the saw, the blade, everything. So this is a double bevel saw, which means it can swing either direction. So we're going to center it or put it back to 0, which is perfectly vertical. There's a pin that you're going to remove. It will release the saw, and now it can swing to the other side. Make sure that this other fence is swung out of the way so that we have clearance for the blade on this side when we make that cut. On the front of this saw, you're going to see your bevel gauge adjustment angle. This arrow is going to point to whatever angle the saw is set at. As you can see right now, it's set at a 45-degree angle relative to that vertical position. There's a knob, as you see on the presentation, there is a knob on the back that you have to loosen to get this saw to swing either side. Make sure that you tighten that knob once you get the setting that you want so that that saw is not going to move when you're dropping it into the material. When do we want to make bevel cuts? Bevel cuts come into play when we're doing advanced things like crown molding and some complicated trim processes, finish carpentry, that kind of thing. You would always choose a miter cut before you would choose a bevel cut, and I will demonstrate that in our shop when we go out and make some cuts. But if you have a choice, for instance, this board here, we can make this cut by setting our miter angle to 45. That would be my preferred way to do it. You could also make this cut by setting the piece this direction and then putting my bevel setting over to 45 degrees. This to me is the least ideal situation. A bevel cut is complicated, it's hard on the blade, it's really hard to sight the cut, and it puts the material in strange positions, and it really is a hard thing for us to set up and follow through with. So if you have a choice, choose the miter cut. A compound miter saw can do more than just a simple squared cut or a simple mitered cut. We can do 2 angle cuts at the same time. So as you see here, my saw is set on my miter gauge at 45 degrees. We were doing that before, but I've added a bevel angle to this. The saw is leaning this direction and it's set at 30 degrees. So we're going to go ahead and make this cut. Material needs to be tight to the fence. This side of the fence has to be out of the way of the spinning blade, so that's been extended out. My outfeed support is holding the board. Let's make this cut. So you can see I not only have a 45-degree cut, but I also have a back cut of 30 degrees on the end of that board. So there is my compound miter cut. That's 2 angles cut in the board at the same time. It takes a lot of setup for this saw, so it's not something that you would do, you would be resetting the saw for every cut. So let's talk about the steps to set up and tear down the compound miter saw. I've got my saw right here. First thing to mention is that there is a handle built in to help carry this tool. It's generally on the top of the saw, and it's generally put in a place to help balance the weight of the saw. This is not a carry handle. It's not made to support the saw, nor is it in a place that balances the saw. Here's your carry handle. Next up, we're going to have the dust bag. This bag is a simple cloth bag that's going to collect the sawdust. The saw actually throws the sawdust that it makes into this bag. It's going to get full, so when it gets full, it doesn't work anymore. Then the sawdust starts clogging up the saw. It starts piling up on the table. It's going to get in the way of accuracy and work using the saw properly. So this comes off very easily without any tools. There's a little pinch point here and the clamp comes off. If you need to change the bag, it's as simple as opening up or unzipping the bag and dumping it into a trash can. The pivot arm lock allows us to lift this saw. We talked about the saw always wants to be in an open position, ready to be lowered into the material. There is a pivot lock or a pin behind the fence here that you're going to pull out, and you're going to push it in to lock the saw. It locks into a little hole in the spring arm, and the trick of this is that you have to push down on the saw to relieve the pressure of the spring on the spring arm. That's going to allow you to pull this pin out. So the pin is completely out. Now the saw is going to move freely. So you're going to release it under control. Now the saw is one step closer to being able to be used. Now we need to plug this saw in. There is a short cord on this saw. I like to see it wrapped around the motor housing. This is a great place to store the cord so it's not dragging along on the ground while you're transporting it. So we're going to unwind this. Now this can be plugged in. Generally, you don't want the cord in the front or in the way of your material or possibly where the blade can cut it. So you're going to put this behind, you'll hook it up to the power when it's time to do that. So now with your outfeed supports, you're pretty much ready to go. Make sure that you're watching your angle, your miter angle. You set it at what you want it to be, and you're also checking your bevel angle at the moment before you're making your cut. Now that we've made some square cuts, some miter cuts, some bevel cuts, and we've learned all about the parts and features of this saw, let's do a quick review. Keep your supporting hand outside of the fence at all times. This is the one most likely to get injured. Make sure that the miter angle is locked into place. Use outfeed supports at all times. This is going to keep your material supported, and once you make your cut, nothing will move. It will be fully under control. Make sure that you never start the saw spinning while it's touching the material. It should be backed off, and get that saw up to full speed before you actually make the cut. Make sure you always place the kerf of the blade on the scrap side. Use a miter cut instead of a bevel if you have that option. It's safer and it leads to more accuracy. When cutting bevels, make sure that the fence, the movable part of the fence, is loosened and moved clear of that moving blade. Allow the saw to stop completely before raising the blade up. Sometimes that spinning blade can catch your material and make for trouble. This is a list of terms used in this presentation, and as always, I like to stress this idea of learning the language of building and using it on the job site. So I hope you've learned something about this fantastic power tool we call the compound miter saw, and some of the things you can do with it on the job. Thanks for watching. Let's get back to work. This video is a production of Trade Skills U, all rights reserved. If you provide instruction in the construction trades and have a need for videos like these, please contact us at tradeskillsu.com.